May 27th, 1943. A B-24 Liberator bomber named Green Hornet took off from Funafuti Atoll in the Pacific on a search and rescue mission. The aircraft was a spare, poorly maintained, with a history of mechanical problems. 8 crew members were aboard, including Bombardier Second Lieutenant Louis Zamperini, a former Olympic runner who had competed in the 5,000 meters at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. At 850 feet altitude, the port engine failed. The pilot attempted to maintain control, but the starboard engine also failed. The B-24 stalled and plummeted into the Pacific Ocean. The impact killed 5 crew members instantly. 3 survived: Zamperini, pilot Russell Allen Phillips, and tail gunner Francis McNamara. They clung to debris as the aircraft sank beneath them. Within minutes, they pulled 2 inflatable rafts from the wreckage and climbed aboard. They were adrift in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, over 850 miles from land. The rafts contained minimal supplies: a few chocolate bars, 8 half-pints of water, fishing line, hooks, flares, and a patching kit. No radio, no way to signal for help except the flares, which they would save for when rescue aircraft appeared. Rescue never came. Zamperini, Phillips, and McNamara drifted for 47 days, over 2,000 miles across the Pacific. They survived on rainwater, raw fish, and occasional seabirds they caught with their hands. Sharks circled constantly. Japanese aircraft strafed them. The sun burned their skin. Thirst and starvation brought them to the edge of death. McNamara died on day 33. Zamperini and Phillips drifted for another 2 weeks before washing ashore on the Marshall Islands, controlled by Japan. Their ordeal did not end. They were captured immediately. For the next 2 years, Zamperini endured torture, starvation, forced labor, and psychological abuse in Japanese POW camps. He was singled out for particularly brutal treatment by a sadistic guard known as the Bird. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Zamperini had survived experiences that would have killed most men. This is the story of those 47 days and 2 years. The crash occurred at 2:30 p.m. The B-24 hit the water nose first at high speed. The impact shattered the aircraft's structure and killed the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and engineer instantly. Zamperini was in the nose turret when the plane hit. The force of the impact threw him forward, but he was not killed. Water flooded the fuselage. Zamperini held his breath and swam toward daylight, pulling himself through the wreckage and surfacing, gasping for air. Phillips and McNamara also survived. Phillips, the pilot, had been at the controls when the engines failed. He was thrown clear of the cockpit and surfaced near Zamperini. McNamara, in the tail section, escaped as the tail broke off and floated briefly before sinking. The 3 men clung to floating debris, seat cushions, pieces of fuselage, and called out to each other. The rafts inflated automatically when they hit the water. There were 2, a larger raft and a smaller one. The men pulled themselves into the rafts and took stock of their situation. They were alive, but stranded. The crash site was in the middle of the Pacific, far from any shipping lanes or islands. The likelihood of rescue was small. The likelihood of survival was smaller. The first priority was inventory. The rafts contained emergency supplies: a few chocolate bars, 8 half-pints of water, fishing hooks and line, a flare gun with several flares, a mirror for signaling, a patching kit, and a small pump. The supplies were intended to sustain survivors for a few days until rescue arrived. Rescue did not come. They rationed the water immediately. Each man received 2 sips per day, barely enough to wet the mouth. Thirst was immediate and overwhelming. Surrounded by seawater, they could not drink. Seawater causes dehydration, kidney failure, and death. They knew this, but were tormented by the sight of water everywhere. The chocolate bars were divided, 1 square per man per day. The chocolate provided minimal calories but was gone within a week. After that, They had no food except what they could catch. Phillips had fishing line and hooks. They tried fishing but caught nothing the first few days. The ocean appeared empty. They floated in a vast blue desert, starving and thirsty under a merciless sun. On the third day, a rainstorm passed over them. They held their mouths open to catch drops. They spread the raft's canvas to funnel water into their mouths. The rain lasted only minutes, but provided enough water to sustain them for another day. Rain became their lifeline. When it rained, they drank. When it did not, they suffered. By the end of the first week, they were severely dehydrated and starving. Lips cracked and bled. Skin burned and peeled. They had lost weight visibly. Zamperini's Olympic fitness was fading. Phillips, older and less physically robust, was weaker. McNamara, the youngest, was terrified and struggled psychologically. Sharks appeared on the second day. Oceanic white-tip sharks, drawn by the vibrations of the rafts and the presence of the men. The sharks circled constantly, dark shapes visible beneath the water. They bumped the rafts, testing them. The men kicked at sharks that came too close, striking them with oars or fists. The sharks did not attack aggressively. They were curious, probing, waiting. The psychological effect was crushing. The men knew that if they fell into the water, the sharks would attack. They clung to the rafts, terrified of capsizing. At night, the sharks were invisible, but audible, splashing, circling, brushing against the rafts. Sleep was impossible. The men took turns watching, alert for any threat. On day 8, a shark leaped into the raft. It thrashed violently, jaws snapping, tail whipping. The men scrambled to avoid it. Zamperini grabbed the shark and wrestled it, trying to throw it overboard. The shark bit his hand, tearing flesh. Blood spread across the raft. Phillips and McNamara helped push the shark out. It splashed back into the water, leaving blood and chaos behind. The men realized they could eat the shark. Zamperini used a knife to cut open a shark they had killed. The meat was tough and fishy, but edible. They ate it raw, gagging on the taste and texture, but it provided protein and fat. Shark meat became a staple. They learned to catch sharks by hand, grabbing them when they approached the raft and hauling them aboard. It was dangerous, but it kept them alive. Thirst remained the greater torment. Days passed without rain. The men's tongues swelled. Urine became dark and scant. Hallucinations began. They saw islands on the horizon that did not exist. They heard voices calling from the water. Dehydration affected judgment and coordination. McNamara became increasingly irrational, talking to himself, crying, and refusing to help with survival tasks. Zamperini took charge. His Olympic training had taught him mental toughness and discipline. He set routines. Check the rafts for leaks, repair punctures, fish during the day, watch for planes, collect rain when it came. Routine provided structure and prevented despair. Phillips supported Zamperini's leadership. McNamara followed but contributed little. The men caught seabirds, albatrosses that landed on the raft. The birds were curious and unafraid. The men grabbed them, killed them, and ate the meat raw. Bird meat was lean and tough but provided calories. They saved bird intestines as bait for fishing. Nothing was wasted. By the third week, the men were skeletal. Ribs protruded, eyes were sunken, skin hung loose. Zamperini estimated they had drifted over 1,000 miles. Currents carried them west, toward the Marshall Islands, though they did not know this. Each day was a battle to survive until the next rain, the next fish, the next bird. On day 27, they heard the sound of aircraft engines. The Japanese bomber appeared on the horizon, flying low over the water. The men's first reaction was hope. Rescue! They waved, shouted, and prepared to light a flare. Then they saw the rising sun emblem on the fuselage. Japanese. Not rescue. Threat. The bomber circled and descended toward the rafts. The men realized what was about to happen. They dove into the water seconds before the bomber opened fire. Machine gun bullets stitched across the water, tearing through the rafts. The men submerged, holding their breath as bullets zipped past. Sharks circled below. The men stayed under as long as they could, surfacing only to gasp for air before diving again. The bomber made multiple passes, firing each time. The attack lasted minutes but felt endless. When the bomber finally departed, the men climbed back into the shredded rafts. Both rafts were riddled with bullet holes. Air hissed out. The rafts deflated rapidly. The patching kit became critical. The men used patches and glue to seal the holes, working frantically as the rafts lost buoyancy. They inflated the rafts using the hand pump, a slow and exhausting process. By nightfall, the rafts held air again, but they were weakened. Any additional damage could be fatal. The attack shattered any hope of rescue. The Japanese controlled this region of the Pacific. American search planes would not come here. The men were in enemy territory, adrift and defenseless. If they reached land, they would be captured. If they stayed adrift, they would die. There were no good options. McNamara's mental state collapsed after the strafing. He stopped eating, stopped talking, and lay motionless in the raft. Zamperini and Phillips tried to encourage him, but he had given up. On day 33, McNamara died. His body was committed to the ocean. Zamperini said a prayer. Phillips wept. They were now two. The loss of McNamara affected the survivors differently. Zamperini felt relief, one less mouth competing for limited resources, but also guilt for feeling relief. Phillips mourned his crewmate but acknowledged that survival was now more feasible with two instead of three. The raft had more space, rations stretched further, but the psychological burden of watching a man die from despair was crushing. After McNamara's death, Zamperini and Phillips drifted for another 14 days. They were beyond emaciated. Zamperini had lost over 80 pounds. Phillips had lost nearly 100. Their bodies consumed muscle for energy. Movement required immense effort. They spoke little, conserving energy. Rain came sporadically. When it rained, they drank greedily, filling their mouths and stomachs. When it did not, they endured thirst that drove them to the edge of madness. Zamperini had vivid hallucinations, conversations with family members, meals he had eaten years ago, races he had run. He knew the hallucinations were not real, but could not stop them. Sharks remained constant companions. The men had stopped fearing them. Fear required energy they did not have. When sharks bumped the raft, the men kicked at them reflexively, but without panic. They had become numb to the danger. Birds still landed on the raft occasionally. The men caught and ate them. Fish were harder to catch as the men weakened. Their hands were slow, their coordination poor. But they caught enough to survive. Barely. Zamperini's faith deepened during the final weeks. Raised Catholic, but not particularly religious, he began praying daily. He made bargains with God. If I survive this, I will dedicate my life to your service. He did not know if God heard him, but prayer provided comfort and structure. Phillips, quieter and more reserved, retreated into himself. He spoke rarely, responding to Zamperini's questions with monosyllables. He was not giving up. He continued to fish, repair the raft, and help with survival tasks, but he had withdrawn emotionally. The trauma of 47 days at sea had broken something inside him. On July 13th, 1943, day 47, they saw land, an island on the horizon. They were too weak to paddle toward it. The current carried them. As they drifted closer, they saw structures, buildings, a dock. The island was inhabited. They did not know if it was Allied or Japanese territory. It was Japanese. The raft washed ashore on one of the Marshall Islands, controlled by Japan since World War I. Japanese soldiers were waiting on the beach. Zamperini and Phillips were pulled from the raft, too weak to stand. They were prisoners. The Japanese soldiers who found Zamperini and Phillips were shocked by their condition. The men were skeletons, skin stretched over bone, eyes sunken, beards matted. They could not walk. They could barely speak. The soldiers gave them water and rice, which they vomited immediately. Their stomachs could not process food after 47 days of starvation. They were taken to a Japanese military base on the island. An officer interrogated them through an interpreter. Zamperini and Phillips provided their names, ranks, and serial numbers as required by the Geneva Convention. The officer demanded more information about their unit, their mission, American military plans. They refused to answer. The interrogation turned violent. The men were struck with fists and rifle butts. Zamperini was beaten unconscious. Phillips was threatened with execution. The interrogations continued for days. The men gave nothing beyond the basics. The Japanese officer, frustrated, sent them to a POW camp on another island. The journey to the camp took weeks. The men were transported by ship, held in the cargo hold with other prisoners. Conditions were horrific. No sanitation, minimal food, disease spreading among the prisoners. Zamperini contracted dysentery and nearly died.
Phillips developed infected wounds. Both men were on the verge of death when they arrived at Kwajalein Atoll, a Japanese military base known to prisoners as Execution Island. Kwajalein was a holding facility for prisoners awaiting transfer. It was not officially a POW camp, so the Geneva Convention protections did not apply. Prisoners were treated as spies or criminals, not soldiers. Beatings were routine. Food was minimal, a small ball of rice per day. Medical care was non-existent. Many prisoners died at Kwajalein. Zamperini and Phillips were held in a cell, a small, dark room with no windows. They were interrogated repeatedly. Japanese officers were particularly interested in Zamperini because of his Olympic background. They believed an Olympic athlete might have valuable intelligence or propaganda value. Zamperini had neither. The psychological torture began. Guards told Zamperini that America was losing the war, that his family believed he was dead, that he would never leave the island alive. They forced him to write propaganda statements praising Japan and condemning America. He refused. The beatings intensified. Phillips fared worse. His injuries from the crash and the raft ordeal had not healed. He developed infections. His mental state deteriorated. He withdrew further, speaking rarely, eating little. Zamperini feared Phillips would not survive. After weeks at Kwajalein, the men were transferred to Ofuna, a secret interrogation camp near Yokohama, Japan. Ofuna was not a registered POW camp. The Red Cross did not know it existed. Prisoners held there had no legal protections. They could be tortured, starved, or executed without consequence. For Zamperini, Ofuna was the beginning of a nightmare that would last until the end of the war. Ofuna was a camp for high-value prisoners, pilots, naval officers, and anyone the Japanese believed might have useful intelligence. The camp was small, holding about 200 prisoners at any time. The conditions were designed to break men psychologically and physically. Prisoners lived in small cells, isolated from each other. Contact between prisoners was forbidden. Speaking was forbidden. Punishment for any infraction was immediate and brutal. Guards beat prisoners with clubs, fists, and bamboo sticks. Some prisoners were subjected to water torture, electric shocks, or mock executions. Food at Ofuna was starvation rations. Prisoners received a small bowl of rice or barley twice a day, approximately 600 calories total. Men lost weight rapidly. Vitamin deficiencies caused beriberi, scurvy, and other diseases. Prisoners' teeth fell out. Wounds did not heal. Many prisoners died from malnutrition or disease. Zamperini's interrogations at Ofuna were relentless. Japanese officers wanted information about American aircraft, bombing strategies, and military plans. Zamperini knew little. He was a bombardier on a failed rescue mission. But the interrogators did not believe him. They assumed an Olympic athlete and B-24 crew member must have valuable intelligence. The interrogations followed a pattern. Questions, refusal to answer, beating, repeat. Zamperini learned to give answers that sounded plausible, but contained no useful information. He lied about his unit's location, the number of aircraft, and mission details. The interrogators could not verify his answers.
So they accepted some and beat him for others. The psychological warfare was worse than the physical beatings. Guards told prisoners their families had forgotten them, that America was losing the war, that they would never go home. They forced prisoners to read propaganda newspapers describing American defeats. They played recordings of Tokyo Rose, the English-language propaganda broadcaster, mocking American soldiers. Zamperini coped by focusing on small goals. Survive today. Survive this week. Survive until the next Red Cross package, which rarely came. He refused to let the guards see him break.
He maintained his dignity, standing straight during roll call, looking guards in the eye, refusing to bow deeply as required. This defiance made him a target. Phillips, in a different cell, fared poorly. His health continued to decline. He was eventually transferred to another camp, and Zamperini did not see him again until after the war. The separation was devastating. Phillips had been Zamperini's link to the Raft, the shared experience that anchored him. Alone, Zamperini had only his will to survive. In 1944, Zamperini was transferred to Omori, a POW camp on an island in Tokyo Bay. Omori held Allied prisoners, American, British, and Australian soldiers captured throughout the Pacific. The camp was brutal, but it was an improvement over Ofuna. Prisoners could communicate, share news, and support each other. However, Omori had one feature that made it worse than any previous camp. Sergeant Mutsuhiro Watanabe, known to prisoners as the Bird. The Bird was a camp guard notorious for sadism, cruelty, and psychological torture. He singled out prisoners for abuse, particularly officers, athletes, and anyone who showed defiance. The Bird fixated on Zamperini. He recognized Zamperini's Olympic background and saw him as a symbol of American pride that could be broken. The Bird's abuse of Zamperini was relentless, systematic, and personal. He beat Zamperini daily, sometimes multiple times per day. He forced Zamperini to hold heavy wooden beams above his head for hours. When Zamperini's arms sagged, the Bird beat him. If Zamperini collapsed, the Bird kicked him and ordered him to resume the position. The Bird forced Zamperini to perform humiliating tasks, clean latrines with his bare hands, bow repeatedly to guards, sing songs praising Japan. When Zamperini complied, the Bird beat him for not being enthusiastic enough. When Zamperini resisted, the Bird beat him harder. There was no way to avoid the abuse. The psychological aspect was deliberate. The Bird wanted to break Zamperini's spirit, to make him feel worthless and defeated. He told Zamperini he would die in the camp, that his family would never know what happened to him, that he was nothing. The Bird's goal was not just to inflict pain, but to destroy Zamperini's sense of self. Zamperini's survival strategy was mental resistance. He refused to let the Bird see him break. After beatings, he stood up. After humiliations, he maintained eye contact. Inside, he was broken, traumatized, despairing, wishing for death, but outwardly, he remained defiant. This defiance enraged the Bird and resulted in worse abuse, but it was the only way Zamperini could preserve his identity. Other prisoners supported Zamperini. They shared food when they could, offered words of encouragement, and protected him when possible. The solidarity among prisoners was the only thing that made survival bearable. Men who had nothing gave what little they had to help each other. In 1945, as the war turned against Japan, conditions at Omori worsened. Food rations were cut further, Allied bombing of Tokyo increased, and prisoners were forced to work in factories and shipyards despite their weakened condition. Some prisoners died from Allied bombs while on work details. The irony, being killed by your own side, was a bitter end. In August 1945, the war ended. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered on August 15th. For prisoners at Omori, liberation did not come immediately. The guards disappeared overnight, abandoning the camp. Prisoners woke to find the gates open, no guards present, and uncertainty about what to do next.
American aircraft soon appeared, dropping supplies, food, medicine, clothing into the camp. B-29 bombers flew low over Omori, and prisoners cheered, wept, and waved. Zamperini stood on the camp's roof, watching the planes, overwhelmed by the realization that he had survived. Within days, American forces arrived. Prisoners were evacuated to hospitals and processing centers. Zamperini was flown to a military hospital in Okinawa, then to the Philippines, and finally to the United States. He arrived home in October 1945, over 2 years after his plane had crashed. Zamperini's physical recovery took months. He regained weight slowly, though he would never fully recover from the damage to his body. His teeth had rotted, his hearing was impaired. Scars covered his body from beatings and untreated wounds. But he was alive. The psychological recovery was harder. Zamperini suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD. He had nightmares about the bird, waking up screaming, reliving beatings and torture. He drank heavily to numb the memories. His marriage to his wife Cynthia was strained by his trauma and anger. Zamperini's life after the war was tumultuous. He struggled with alcoholism and rage. He fantasized about returning to Japan to find the bird and kill him. His life spiraled until 1949, when Cynthia convinced him to attend a Billy Graham evangelical crusade in Los Angeles. Zamperini experienced a religious conversion. He quit drinking, stopped the nightmares, and forgave his tormentors, including the bird. Zamperini dedicated the rest of his life to public speaking, sharing his story of survival and forgiveness. He returned to Japan multiple times, meeting with former guards and offering forgiveness. He carried the Olympic torch in the 1998 Nagano Winter Olympics, running past the site of the camp where he had been held. The bird, who had evaded war crimes prosecution, refused to meet him. Louis Zamperini died in 2014 at age 97. His story, documented in Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken, and the subsequent film, remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories of World War II. 47 days adrift, 2 years of torture, and a lifetime of resilience. Zamperini's story is a testament to the limits of human endurance and the power of the will to survive.